There is no longer a federal constitutional right to an abortion.
The Supreme Court has essentially reshaped American life.
It's going to be legal chaos.
Where abortion is legal in about half the states, illegal in half the states.
Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. On Friday, 24 June, the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending 50 years of federal abortion rates. 26 states are expected to ban abortion immediately or as soon as possible. The ruling has sent shockwaves throughout the U.S., where pro-choice supporters immediately condemned it, while many conservatives praised the decision. President Biden condemned the ruling, calling it a tragic error, and even accused the Supreme Court of outrageous behavior. But what will be the impact of this ruling outside the U.S.? How will it affect women's rights globally? Will this decision open the door to other rights that have previously been protected? These are the questions that we will be looking at in this episode of What Matters Today. My guest for this episode is Dr. Nicole Bourbonnais, who is an associate professor of international history and politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Dr. Bourbonnais' research focuses on the transnational history of reproduction, population, sex, motherhood, and the family in the 20th century. Her first book, Birth Control in the Decolonizing Caribbean, Reproductive Politics and Practice on Four Islands, 1930 to 1970, traced how birth control campaigns in Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and Bermuda were shaped by colonialism, nationalist movements, social activism, and working-class women's efforts to control their reproductive lives. Her current project, The Gospel of Family Planning, A Global History, explores the rise and spread of the transnational family planning movement from the 1940s to 1980s and the turn to a reproductive rights paradigm in the 1990s. She's also interested in the links between anti-racist and feminism activism in the 20th century and the history of maternal and child health. So I guess the first question to ask is, why is abortion such a controversial issue?
You know, I think it's partly due to the nature of abortion itself. You know, of course, it taps into such a personal, intimate sphere of our lives, the realm of reproduction, of the family. It can bring up questions of faith and religion, of the nature of life itself, all of which obviously can invoke really strong, really deeply felt emotions and opinions. But whether this actually develops into a site of public debate or controversy or state regulation really depends much more on the politics and the broader context of a place and time, right? I mean, abortion has been practiced eternally, but it's only become the site of public controversy and public attention at particular moments. Even in the United States, it wasn't until the early 1800s that states started passing explicit statutes on abortion. Before that, it was regulated by English common law and generally not considered a crime before quickening, which is when the woman starts to feel the baby, so about 15 to 20 weeks. And it wasn't necessarily socially acceptable at that time, but there were a range of abortion methods on the market. Some abortion practitioners advertised their services fairly openly without this kind of controversy. And some historians have argued that those initial abortion bans in the 1800s had more to do with medical practitioners trying to assert control over the field or to prevent mortality from unhygienic practices rather than a moral question per se. And in terms of this particular moment of controversy around abortion in the United States, most have connected it to the rise of anti-choice movements largely after the Roe v. Wade decision. This is also connected to the broader rise of evangelical movements, their increasing influence on the Republican Party. There is a politically significant section of the population that vote almost entirely on the question of abortion, which has an obvious impacts on political positioning. You could see this, for example, in the case of Trump, who actually had stated publicly his pro-choice position in the 1990s and then shifted to anti-choice as he became a politician, which of course then led to the election of anti-choice justices to the Supreme Court and this overturning of Roe v. Wade. So I think while abortion does have a certain underlying potential to become a point of political controversy, whether or not that actually happens depends a lot on these political, social, cultural, historical contexts.
Right, thanks for that. And as we all know, on Friday, 24 June, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending 50 years of federal abortion rights. What are the consequences of this decision? And so what are the impacts of these kinds of legal restrictions that they have on people's lives and healthcare services?
Right. So the bans the bans that will be put in place have different stipulations, different exceptions. Most would ban it after 6 weeks. Now, keep in mind that due to the way they calculate pregnancy, by the time a woman misses her period, she's already considered 4 weeks pregnant. So a 6-week ban makes it nearly impossible in practice to actually get an abortion. Some of the bans might continue to allow abortions to save the health or life of the mother, or in cases of rape or incest, which sounds fine in theory, but of course, those kinds of situations are actually very difficult to work out in practice. Any pregnancy is a risk to the health of the mother. There are a whole host of different risks of complications in both pregnancy and childbirth, and determining exactly when that risk justifies a medical abortion legally can be really difficult and puts the doctor essentially in a vulnerable legal position, which will then have a broader chilling effect regardless if technically this exception is allowed. It's also very difficult to prove rape or incest has taken place. I mean, investigations for those types of crimes can take months or years, at which point the woman is basically out of luck. So in practice, these kinds of exceptions don't really allow for as much as they might seem at first. So what we know from history and from other countries where abortion is subject to these kinds of restrictions is that they do not stop abortions from happening. Right. Women have everywhere throughout history sought out abortions regardless of the law. Those women who can afford it will likely travel to the next state that allows it to have an abortion under medical supervision. And those who can't may try to do it in their own home. Wow. Now, I should say that, due to the invention of the medical abortion pill, self-managed abortions are actually safer than they ever have been before in history. To do it at home on your own, but not all cases can use those pills. So it depends on the stage, on whether you have any pre-existing conditions and things like that. And obviously the illegality of this makes the pregnant person and anyone who helps them really, really vulnerable to, obviously legal action. Now, those who can't take these risks will essentially be forced to carry their pregnancy to term regardless of their personal circumstances. And as a result, we can expect to see a rise overall in maternal morbidity and mortality, negative impacts on women's mental health and well-being. Studies have shown that people forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term are more likely to remain in an abusive relationship, more likely to live in poverty, to be unemployed, to lack resources for basic needs. It also affects their ability to care for children that they have. We know that the majority of those who seek abortions in the U.S. are already parents. And we also know that these effects will be worse for those who face additional structural barriers. So people of color, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, with low income, those living in rural areas. So we can expect this ruling to enhance reproductive inequality, but also broader inequalities as well around race, class, gender, ability.
Right. Wow. Lots of consequences there. And with the retraction of Roe versus Wade, there seems to be a looming fear that now worldwide women's rights will take a step back and that the anti-choice movement will gain ground. What are the potential repercussions of this U.S. decision for women's rights globally?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this development provides momentum to anti-choice movements and anti-women's rights movements in general around the world. It sends a message that a body like the Supreme Court does not consider bodily autonomy to be a human right, which is a very powerful message. There are also American anti-choice organizations that work both in the U.S. and internationally, kind of funding and supporting anti-choice movements abroad. So I could see that, perhaps they now have more resources to devote to international work. So that could even kind of have a direct impact. The U.S. government is also a major donor to reproductive health programs around the world. So political developments in the U.S. can have serious global impacts. We've already seen this in the past, for example, through the Helms Amendment passed in 1973, which prevents U.S. funding for abortion services abroad, as well as the global gag rule or Mexico City policy, which was enacted by Reagan in 1984, and it prevents organizations abroad who receive funding from the U.S. to provide abortion services or referrals, even with their own money. This policy was rescinded in 1993 under Clinton, brought back by Bush, and has basically kind of gone back and forth over the years, depending on whether a Republican or Democratic government is in power. Now, the Biden administration as well overturned this again last year and recently has reaffirmed its commitment to sexual and reproductive health internationally, regardless of the Supreme Court decision. But of course, it's still, troubling to have a major donor with such complicated politics at home. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't overestimate the influence of developments in the U.S. So there are other donors who have really positioned themselves as champions of the full spectrum of reproductive rights. A lot of organizations with the UN have become much stronger on this recently. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, Dr. Mofokeng, for example, is a very strong reproductive rights advocate. She actually served as lead expert on an amicus brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, encouraging them not to overturn it. And just a couple of days ago, Sierra Leone's president announced that his government had unanimously backed a bill to decriminalize abortion in the country, which has been, of course, the result of years of lobbying by women's movements. Right. But yeah, I thought it was interesting in the announcement, he specifically stressed the importance of the reform at a time when sexual and reproductive health rights for women are either being overturned or threatened. So, maybe we will even see a kind of backlash to the backlash against women's rights. As people, mobilize in reaction to these extreme developments and some states try to position themselves as more progressive.
Thank you for that. And this next question kind of touches on a few things you've mentioned about decriminalizing and also, depending on the politics involved, the way certain decisions go. So although women's human rights and gender equality in the U.S. have been handed a huge blow with this decision, as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet said, pro-choice movements in places in Latin America have gained ground in the past 2 years, with certain countries even decriminalizing and legalizing abortion. Could it be said that the legalities surrounding abortion and more generally women's rights are always in flux, dependent on the government's left or right tendencies and judgments?
Yeah, I think that's true in many ways. I should say that overall, the trend we've seen in the last 50 or so years is towards the liberalization of abortion laws globally, and that has even accelerated recently. So since 2000, for example, 37 countries have liberalized their abortion laws, many making it available on request. Only a handful of countries have gone the opposite way, including Nicaragua, which banned abortion completely without exception in 2006, and Poland, which recently increased limitations on access. Still, the majority of countries in the world have a number of restrictions still in their abortion laws. Some of these are actually old colonial laws that were never adjusted. Some of them are not enforced, but in any case, they do lead to the kinds of complications and vulnerabilities I was discussing earlier. However, I will say that it's not always a question of left versus right. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in 2006, it was actually a left-wing government in Nicaragua that passed its total ban on abortion.
Interesting. Well.
This was a party that had been in power for decades, had supported women's rights, but essentially saw its power slipping and made a strategic alliance with the church to gain its support in the election in return for an aggressive stance on abortion. So kind of very clearly, a political move. And interestingly, in that same year, in contrast to Colombia, relaxed its abortion laws under a conservative government in that case, due to mobilizations of a strong women's movement, and that case filed through the Constitutional Court. And actually this year it's even reduced the restrictions even further, making it legal without restrictions to 24 weeks. So essentially there are many factors that play in each case. There's this complex political and legal landscape that can lead to one outcome or another. I do think these outcomes remind us that history is not linear. We don't always move towards being more and more progressive.
Right.
Things can shift, and reproductive rights and women's rights are often particularly vulnerable because they do have that, that potential to invoke such strong emotions. Probably the only way to guarantee it in the long term is for abortion access to become not only allowed, but actually culturally accepted and normalized to the degree that it becomes less politically useful. And I think for that to happen, we need to talk about it a lot more, not only as a legal or moral question, but, actually discuss the realities that people face in their reproductive lives. So the difficulty of negotiating contraception in sexual relationships, sometimes in a context of coercion or violence, the fact that contraception is not 100% effective, the reality of pregnancy, what that actually entails, physically, mentally, emotionally, and the really broad impacts of childbearing on women's lives, economic, social, etc. I think, often when you move beyond this philosophical discussion and get down into that, kind of nitty gritty, it really becomes hard to maintain some of that polarization that we often see on the political level.
Very good point. Thanks for that. And my last question is, people are worried that the undoing of Roe v. Wade can open the door to other rights that have been previously protected. So specifically, some believe that this decision could lead to restrictions on access to birth control. And a recent New Yorker article, actually dated on July 1st, this past Friday, mentions the following. The right to access contraception radically expanded women's economic prospects. By overturning Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court has laid a roadmap for reconsidering that right. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And actually, Justice Clarence Thomas, in his concurring opinion, specifically argued that past rulings on contraception access as well as same-sex relationships should be reconsidered.
That's right, yeah.
So, essentially, right, inviting those kinds of cases to the court. Honestly, I mean, even if they did overturn the right to contraception, I can't imagine states outright banning contraception altogether. Even many of the most conservative groups don't call for that. But there is a real concern that states would ban or set restrictions on certain types of methods, particularly emergency contraception, Plan B, or even IUDs, which some conservative groups claim are abortion methods. So I think that is a really legitimate concern. And also the concern about the right to same-sex marriage that was only very recently divided is still, a political subject. So I think these are really real concerns. And I think really what Thomas's opinion shows is that for at least some sections of this court and of the U.S. more broadly, this is about much more than just, the life of the fetus. It's also about imposing a conservative vision of gender and sexuality more broadly on society. And, this is also not just about women participating in the economy or not. We know that so much about women's health and well-being depends on reproductive freedom. Reproductive justice scholars and activists have argued that, for reproductive freedom, we need not only the right to abortion, but also to contraception, the right to be free from reproductive coercion. There's also a history in the U.S. of forced sterilizations, for example. Mm-hmm. And reproductive justice needs to include the right and resources to have children and raise them in a safe and sustainable environment, meaning parental leave, child support, all those other resources that make it actually possible to have a family. And if we don't provide that and then remove the ability to prevent or terminate a pregnancy, we essentially place a tremendous load on women that can have really massive repercussions for their lives and those around them as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. As I said, that was my last question. But again, thank you so much. This was very enlightening. And thank you for being part of this podcast series.
Thanks, Dan.
That was Dr. Nicole Bourbonnais discussing the global implications of the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.